It's my pleasure to introduce our poet tonight. I've been looking forward to this reading. Scott grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area and the mountains of Northern California. He's lived in Oregon on and off for the past 23 years. In his day job, he works as a land use planning consultant to small towns and cities across the western U.S. In his book, Some Weather, which we have here, one of the interesting things to note is the connection Scott talks about poetry and his work as a land use planner. He received his bachelor's in geography with honors from Oregon State and a master's in planning from PSU. Currently, he lives in Lake Oswego with his wife and 2 daughters and serves as treasurer on the Friends of the William Stafford Board. Plainview Press published Scott's full-length poetry collection, Some Weather, in 2008. Pudding House released the chapbook Untitled Country in June. This year, the Oregon State Library and Poetry Northwest selected Some Weather as one of the 150 outstanding poetry books, one for each year of statehood. Scott has also received prizes and commendations for his poems from the Oregon State Poetry Association, Nimrod International, and Aesthetica magazine. I already said that his poem, and I want to say this again, Autumn Turns Through Stratified Wars is a pushcart nominee this year. And he has had recent work appearing in or forthcoming in the Centrifugal Eye, Drash, Front Porch, High Desert Journal, Lyric Poetry Magazine in the UK, New Verse News, The Oregonian, Right Hand Pointing, The Smoking Poet, Verse Weavers, and Windfall. He also has photography featured online at Right Hand Pointing and Left Hand Waving. So that is terrific.
Great.
Yes.
I hope he's here.
So we were saying that earlier, and I see him waving in the back, so we know Scott is here. And does the volume level on the microphone sound right to everybody? I'm getting nods. It sounds like that's good. Would we welcome our poet tonight, Scot Siegel? Scott.
Thank you, Don. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Yeah. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Don. Happy birthday to you. Recorded forever. Well, thank you. Thank you for turning out this evening. 24 degrees. This is exciting. I'd like to thank the city of Milwaukie. As Tom said, in my day job, I work as a planner, and my clients are almost exclusively public agencies, and I work with small towns and cities around Oregon and in a number of western states. I've been doing some work in southeast Alaska, and I served on the planning commission in Lake Oswego up until recently. And it's sometimes people ask me, how do you reconcile the presumptions that there's some conflict between the exacting nature of city planning and the more free thinking or loosely structured thought process of a poet. Ultimately, both the poet and the public policy maker or advisor are after the truth. And so that's what I say, is that we're really just after the truth, and one uses analysis and political compromise and negotiation and mediation, and the other uses figurative speech, but basically both are addressing the same things and holding a mirror up to the world. I'm not going to talk a lot about city planning tonight. What I am going to talk about is, as little as possible, I'll talk about how I take an approach to poetry that might be bordering on prose at times. I lean toward accessible poetry. One of my favorite poets of all times, as with many of you, I think, is William Stafford. And so accessible, so poignant, omniscient in the way he wrote, and I really admire that a lot. So that's one of my biases or orientations, is just toward accessible poetry, and I think it's important. I think I've attended more readings. I'm sure I've attended more readings as a listener, as a member of the audience, than readings that I've presented myself. And I don't know about you, but when I find a book that I really like, a book of poetry that I really like, and I read through it, I feel lucky if there are two or three poems in that collection that really stick and that I remember the next day and I'm still thinking about, I go back and read again. Ultimately, the collection should work as a collection, I think. But it's difficult to write memorable poems. It's even more difficult to write important poems. And a poet recently told me, she's a professor in Eastern Oregon, made that point that it's one thing to write good poems, it's another thing to write important poems. And I don't know that I've accomplished either one. I think I have, but I'm going to read some poetry tonight. I know, having sat through poetry readings, that I really wish the poet would have explained a little bit more about where the inspiration came from without over-talking the poem, just to provide a little context, because when you read a poetry book, you have the benefit of reflecting on who is this author, what has he or she written previously, how do I connect the dots and make some sense out of this beyond what's on the page in front of me. So I will tell you that I have 3 segments of poems that I'm going to read this evening. The first segment sort of deals with growing up, because that's what you deal with when you're first starting out as a poet, and that's where most of the memories live. I have 5 poems from that segment. I have another 5 poems from, I couldn't really think of a label or a title for this, and so I kind of, stories that could be true. That's a William Stafford book. And that's so clever, because stories that could be true, it gives you an out. And, a lot of my poems are really, they're autobiographical, like most, and they're direct, and I think they're accessible, so stories that could be true. And then the third, I'll wrap up with some love poems. That's a sort of, what is a love poem? That's a trick question. So, growing up. In the beginning, Cronkite whispered through the walls of my mother's sternum. I am not a baby boomer. I am not a baby boomer, though I saw Bobby shot before the internet, saw his head roll back and the light grow dim on an 8-inch black and white Sony. Faint recollection, the summer of love, that dance the neighbor girl did with one leg on a hook and a ghoulish smile. I was just an infant then, but I remember the stink of geraniums when the news came on and the world went dark in my mother's eyes. So that came from some news this year. Some amazing people who passed away and stoked the memory of that. The day Father's shop burned to the ground. When I'm afraid, I don't think of something my father said. I think of poppies and the wild almond trees on the hill behind our house. And in those years before I became a bar mitzvah, there was a game, hide and seek in the dark. Once when it was my turn to find the others, I hid and kept counting. For a long time, I thought I'd never be found. It was getting dark, and I grew hungry. With a rock, I'd crush the velvet husk of an almond, only to find it shriveled and bitter inside. Far below my hiding place, the dark bay divided our hills from the city. In the distance, San Francisco pulsed and bloomed through a lens of fog and pollution, a luminescent field of poppies. Inside that shell, the old industrial district, a sanctuary for immigrants south of Market, and my father's print shop on 9th Street. The air inside the iron-clad building was a stew of ink, sweat, cigarettes, and hot metal. Ammonia trays, a gaunt man leaned over all day in the dark room, proofing negatives, burning silver plates in solitude. Summers, when the men were under a deadline, I went with my father. I remember the bitter smell, burnt coffee wafting like taxidermy from the west end of the bridge, the sweatshop where Irishmen, Mexicans, Chinese, blacks, and the great-grandson of a Russian rabbi worked side by side, day and night laborers in the melting pot of my father's print shop. We collated and stacked gloss pages of high-fashion catalogs, glued fabric to cardstock. 8 years old, I thought this was the whole world. The pressmen, heroic Irishmen, bulging in sweat-stained t-shirts, the constant hollering over locomotive, click, hiss, clack, suck. Cigarettes under aluminum lamp swing. It was a ballet the way they pirouetted. Cigarettes dangling, canted away from the eyes. It was a ballet the way they pirouetted. Huge sheets of freshly inked paper hefted to the light. Then the sudden jaw twitch release of ashes. My salesman father, polyester sport coat, blue striped tie, would say, "Stay away from them. You don't want to be a pressman. Those machines, saddle stitchers, guillotines, can take a finger or an arm in an instant." Though sometimes he'd soften, like after a good press run, his hand steadying my shoulder, leaning over, showing me how to feed bolts of fabric to the steaming hot swatchbacking machine, pressman looking on, smiling through ink-stained teeth. Then there was Mrs. Hickey. She was never happy. Even after a good press run, she'd be carrying on over something, yelling at my father about some customer or money. She ruled the place with a temper that rivaled the press's, unpredictable around children. I thought she just hated Jews. My mother heard from a neighbor who had been watching the evening news. The building went in less than 2 hours. Oil and ink boiled, and the 2-ton Heidelbergs burned through 2 floors to the basement. Firemen found a pool of molten metal on concrete slab. They said 1 in a string of 5 arsons. Dismal was our dinner that night. My mother slowly twirling in front of the oven, wrapped in telephone cord. I knew it was a time. Something about insurance and grandfather. San Francisco by way of Shanghai grandfather. Son of a Russian Orthodox rabbi grandfather. Family fled Bolshevik persecution grandfather. Once I asked for Grandpa's birthday. Was he alive during the earthquake? Maybe 09 or 12. my mother said. Not even he knows for sure. At the table, a feeling came over that I had never felt before. A black cape when she said, go. Just go outside and play. It had grown dark, and the hills made a forlorn sound. Some bay winds turned up slope and found me. For a long time I counted and shivered under the almond tree, hunched in the dirt alone, turning over stones. What are we going to do? Will my father have the answer? Will they take our home? Then I felt a great surge. A heartbeat stirred among the rocks and grasses. I pressed my ear to the ground and heard the steady taproot pulse of a great clock whirring, and his voice. With love, you sustain the living. With great compassion, give life to all. You send help to the falling and healing to the sick. You bring freedom to the captive and keep faith with those who sleep in the dust. Then I lowered my hands and turned to face the world. Thank you. The last little prayer is Tefillah Amidah. It's a Hebrew prayer, and it's not a high holy day prayer. It's just an everyday, every Sabbath, Shabbat service. It's recited, and I think it's beautiful, so I brought it in, and it's true. The whole story's true. I asked my fact checker, my mother, and she said, it's amazing what a 10-year-old child retains. And I said, yeah. And I thanked her. Here's a poem that originated here in the Pond House, so I thought I should bring it out. And I was fortunate to be able to participate in a workshop here that was led by Paul Ann Peterson, and some of you were here for that, so I'm really happy that I can share this with you. The background is a little darker than that day at the workshop. The prompt question, if you're a writer and you go through a workshop, prompt questions are used to get you thinking about what you want to write about or how you want to approach the poem. And the prompt question, or the prompt, was think about a keepsake and use that as a springboard for writing your poem. Two keepsakes kept jingling around in my head, and I was trying to decide. And one keepsake was a little tobacco box that my grandfather on my mother's side of the family gave me that was at one time full of Morgan dollars, silver dollars. And I just remember the smell of the silver dollars and the tobacco, and I've got to write about that. And then the other image was that of two very old shotguns that my father used to keep under my parents' bed. The guns came from my grandfather on his side of the family. And so there was this battle going on. Do I write about which side of the family do I write about? The gun, I figured I need to write about the guns. So this is Inspecting Grandpa's Gun. I retrieve it from a dry, dark place, pull it from a sleeve, some felt like leather, with our name inscribed on a flimsy tag. I examine it for any trace of him. This was a gift to my father from his true father, the one with spaniels in a hunting lodge, not the one we could not speak of. I take up the heft of it and get the sense I am looking down the long barrel of some unknown history. He always told me, safety on until you're absolutely ready. Watch your stance, hold steady. I scan the room. No window, no door. Just the gun like an iron dove in my hand. I turn it over, brush my finger over the stock, find his initials in smooth silver ridges. I turn it over again and drink from a spring called the pooling of history, a chalice of blood, the Ukrainian forest at dusk. I have his chin when I lift and pump the muzzle, his shoulder when I place it in the crook, his eyes pressing cold metal to my face, then his voice when something faint and terrible in the shape of my real name burns through the cheekpiece. Just going to drift back into childhood for two more poems. And these two, along with the first one that I read about geraniums, are part of a collection that I'm working on. And I'll leave it at that. Chris, 1975. We were best friends. He gave me brass medals pulled from the coats in his mother's closet. He taught me to roll a smoke like a stoic private. We huddled in the side yard by the chrysanthemums, cupped our hands, held a flame out of the wind just under the chimney clean-out. Summer nights, we torched little army men and whirled them about, scorched each other's wrists and arms and thighs. We laughed madly in pretend tents, lighters illuminating sleeping bags. Chris had blonde hair and blue eyes. Nimble on the tennis courts, Chris was well versed in the strategies of chess and Viet Cong tactics. Chris had an affinity for Hitler. I didn't understand this. Chris, whose father never came home. There's a little violence in every child, I think, and in some adults. That's something that I usually don't write about. I think I've heard people say, "Well, Scott writes about positive, uplifting things," and I don't really like. I don't like hearing myself read that poem, but I feel like that's why I needed to write it. And this is the last one I'm going to read from that little collection of childhood memories, I guess. This is called Knocked Up. Geraniums in terracotta pots stacked on a steep stairwell by her house in the East Bay hills made my throat itch. Something about a French horn her father played in the Oakland Symphony. He did not like Lise going out with me. But at 14, I took her to the movies once my mother agreed to drive. That was the last time we dated. They sent me away, boarding school in the mountains, and she got knocked up. I saw her at a party once, maybe a couple years later. I didn't know it then, so I tried getting closer, armed with kind words, a smile, hoping we might reconcile. I wanted to meet her father and mother formally. I was interested in the symphony. but she told me I was too late. Her mother had died of cancer, and in the storm that ensued, her father disowned her. We were 17 when I left her there on a stone garden wall, alone under the jasmine trellis, burning. The next poem I'm going to read, there's too much to read all of it to you, so maybe it's a teaser. But I've been thinking about the Olympics, that's coming up. And this is a big deal for those of us who used to be ski racers. And I see another one in the room. I'm not going to single them out because it might embarrass them. And I haven't really written a whole lot about my background, my history as an athlete. And it's not just with skiing, but it's any sport. What happens to those Olympic athletes, when they're over the hill or when their career is finished. And I was thinking about this because I just got reconnected with a racer I knew back in California who was on the U.S. ski team for a long time. And she's started this website. It's on Facebook, and it's called Racer X. So it's for people who used to race, and they can all find each other and meet each other online. So I'm not going to read, this is a 4-page poem, but I thought I'd just read the little epigraph that begins the poem. It's called Skeleton Recalls Being an Alternate for the Junior Olympics. Kicking out of the start house at 60, I walk through a brisk May day in a bosky mood, reminiscing on nostalgia. Ski racing in the USA was about as popular as lawn bowling or poetry. We did it anyway. We did it anyway. It was all about the art of recovery, a glimpse of immortality, life on the edge. When I'm not walking now, I fly a corporate jet called repression and sip regret like gin in the morning. When airborne, 2/100 of a second is an eternity. So, thank you. I wasn't sure if that was too much of an inside poem, but 2/100. I once lost a downhill race by 2/100 of a second, and it was a qualifying race for the nationals. So, okay. Moving on. Stories that could be true. The Grinder. And I should say this is dedicated to my wife Debbie, who's here in the back. And it's not particularly relevant to our nearly 20-year marriage. We'll be celebrating we just celebrated our 19th anniversary, our 20th is coming up. So this poem is not really relevant to our marriage, but for a while we went through a phase where we were really enjoying late night television. I don't know why. It's really a form of insanity to stay up that late. And so I thought I'd write this, and I don't know if you've ever watched David Letterman, or if you watched David Letterman during the time that he had this act going on, you might recognize some of the characters. The Grinder. For several years, thinking they had found a dead man's boot beside the highway, the brothers scared each other with stories of how it came to rest there. A hitchhiker struck by a runaway van, a homeless man struggling up the embankment after drinking from the river. Maybe a criminal on the run, caught in the patrol car spotlight, ditched his prison clothes there. Then they thought, maybe it was older and fell from a covered wagon, an Indian ambush. The boot was heavy like that. They dared one another to pick the mud away, undo the laces, see what's inside. Bones, they hoped, or maybe some rotten flesh. Because of the boot's apparent age and heft, their father said they must turn it over to the authorities, which they did, of course, with much reluctance. When the forensics came back, to everyone's surprise, that boot was a woolly mammoth's tooth, 10 million years old. Or at least that's what the staid man from the university said. Now that boot or tooth is kept safe out of view in a basement room at the Department of Paleontology. To get inside, security clearance is required. When the local news lady asked about their luck and what they thought of the ongoing study, the boys turned to each other as only boys can do and shrugged. But then the younger one gushed, said he didn't mind all the attention, really, getting him to miss school and all. What he looked forward to most, he said, was an appearance on David Letterman and getting to meet that silver sequin girl with the steel hula hoops and the other one with the grinder. Okay. I told you it wasn't relevant to our anniversary, but I don't know, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Okay. I started off with a poem about my father's shop. And now I'm going to read a poem where, and that poem was primarily about the speaker or the child in the poem. This one really is about the father figure, the father in the poem, I think. His final resting place. Father flies cross-country from Saginaw on the wings of a lime green 59 Plymouth. Boards a plane in LA for Honolulu, hangs up a shingle and sells insurance on the beach to retirees until something better comes around. One day, while trolling the shore break and looking longingly at some dark-skinned girl from the village, by a chance encounter, my future mother, who's 20, a San Franciscan, vacationing with her parents, catches his eye. They spend a few days together, sipping Mai Tai, getting to know him. Who is this Midwesterner surfer boy? Boy, is he really a Jew? And before they can screw, they promise to write and say goodbye. This is how courtships used to begin. 4 years later, back in Saginaw and sick of his mother, my father, the wanderer, heads west again and meets my mother in a foggy diner not far from a gathering of North Beach poets. He had never dreamed he'd have a family in California, could not conceive he'd run a print shop in the city, and never thought he'd return to synagogue, much less with a son. But Grandpa insisted. He built the business with immigrant hands and trusted his daughter's suitor with it. What could father do? Soon I grew in my mother's womb, and the rest is rather ordinary. We vacationed far from the sea in the mountains east of Sacramento. A weak swimmer, I'm still afraid of the ocean. Then, amidst the high-rises of Waikiki, 45 years later, he tells me, as though it is a family secret, that should my mother precede him, we can find him, not in the soot and rubble of Saginaw, and not in the oyster bars of San Francisco, and not on an 8th-story balcony at the Ilikai flipping teriyaki thighs on a hibachi with the howlays of Honolulu, but on the east shore of Oahu, the windward side, the side opposite my parents' Tristan Beach. And he tells me we can find him any morning, barefoot in the rain shadow of the Koolau, waiting the shore break, befriending lost dogs and charming their owners with stories of Waikiki in the early 60s. And he tells me with a glint in the eye that says he's gifted, and I can see it, the way he mixes with the Mokes, becomes one with them, a dark-skinned Midwesterner picnicking in the public waysides from Lanikai to Kianoe. And I know already, everyone loves him, the way they invite him to feast on the succulent meat of Kalua pig, the sweet kulolo pudding, and the buttery flesh of the mahi-mahi. And in this secret cave of grown men weeping, he tells me his pride has wandered off. The green sea and ethereal forests of Pele have taken her. And he tells me that suffering is necessary, that grief is rich and good as poi, and the bitter leaves of the tea guard against all psychic evil. And he tells me, with a far-off look reminiscent of fate, it is a fine kind of suffering on the east shore of Oahu, where the clear creeks of the Kulau run sweeter than wine, and the ohelo berries blooming is never ending. Stories that could be true. This may be the shortest poem I've ever written or had published besides haiku, with a relatively long title. Thousands flee California wildfires. It wasn't arson, but a boy and a girl playing with matches in the oat grass. A cherry bomb his big brother gave him without instructions. I once set the hill behind our house on fire. This is not a confessional poem, this is just a fact. And the Danish man, Jorgen, who lived across the street from us in the East Bay Hills of California, came over and he put it out. But I was probably 10 years old. Don't ask me what I was doing. Okay. So I said I wasn't going to talk much about town planning, and I'm going to try to keep that promise. This is something that I wrote when I was on my way to a job. I work as a town planner in John Day. It's one of the communities I serve as their planner. And so I'm very familiar with all the communities along the way there, and Fossil and Spray and Dayville and Mount Vernon. And it's just, I love the landscape and the people. And many of those little towns, as you probably know, their populations are declining. I mean, some of them are Shaniko. I mean, they're barely there at all. So this is dedicated to the little towns across the West whose populations are declining, and where growth management is not an issue. Trysting Tree of Dayville. There's a tree on that hill where they'd meet after school and swing above town and break all the rules. After the whip crack of 7 rifles, and after the memorial service when the townspeople turn away, she rides barefooted the cottonwood rope swing, toes skimming golden grass blades, summer dress sweeping the blue glass sky. She swings for the mountains, cool fingers feeling down side canyons, yellow pines and alpine blossoms, her husband's skin. Men who knew him all have gone. Junipers shrug where they stood. Her children, too, moved on. No sound fills their room. She swings forward. The cottonwood shimmers. A whole universe returns, sage tinctured, luminous as the river's breath. She swings back. The ropes go slack. Her house, their school, the town, it all spreads out. The desert crackles, rises through her knees, and leaves through her eyes. Like the last time she saw him, their hands intertwined, one life leaving the other, holding on. That poem was from Some Weather, and now I'm going to read a poem from Untitled Country, which is a chapbook from Pudding House. It's called Visiting the Masons' Grand Lodge. You know about the Masons' Lodge in Forest Grove, or outside Forest Grove? Yeah. Okay. Visiting the Masons' Grand Lodge in Forest Grove. The glass is half empty. The night fills it with sighs. We came for a good time, my wife and I, kids at summer camp. Even after 20 years, some things we still do on a whim. It's late, packing now. Didn't even stay the night. The lodge and its rooms are dingy and worn with the pall of those who lived and died here. A siren wails from the highway below. 10 years after the last resident left in protest, the Grand is a boutique hotel now. Micro beers and a movie house. Tourists and young executives drink without a designated driver. Play truth or dare. Watch foreign films or screw for a change. Our room is hot and it smells like the old, my wife says. Though I think hospital, poor farm, asylum, I wonder how many died right here in this room where the walls feel dank, the sash window sticks, and the radiator sits silent as a minister, no hiss, no spit, idle as a visitor slouched in the corner when I turn and close the door behind us. Remember when the weatherman used chalk? Remember that? This is called The World in Our Hands. Okay. Remember when the weatherman used chalk? And those satellite shots came once every 12 hours? We used to warm our hands over television sets. The world was full of potential. Yes, we worried about a Cold War, the possibility of nuclear winter. Now we worry about winter in general, and whether the ice caps are going the way of the dinosaurs, and whether we will too. My mother wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer. I wanted to draw isobars and isotherms, high and low pressure cells and occluded fronts. I wanted to be the weatherman, like nobody's business. Well, then I forgot about the weather and did what all good sons must do. I blew off law school and became an urban planner. Though I'll always remember that frosted glass globe my parents gave me. It was electric, internally lit, and calibrated to the Earth's rotation. It even tracked the sun's path 24/7 until the bulb blew. Now I have the standard issue, a cardboard orb I bought for my daughters when they were in grade school. It's shellacked with countries whose names have changed. It doesn't get much use. These days, when our country's under siege and our leaders are doing their best to negotiate the end of the world, I take the world out of the closet and dust it off, and then I give it a good, hard spin. Thanks. Thank you. Okay. We'll wrap up here with 4 more poems, and these are about 1 minute to 3 minutes apiece. This is on the broadside. It's so wonderful to see my work on a broadside. It's the first time it's ever been printed this way. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah. Autumn turns through stratified wars. A few little leaves alight on the sleeper wind, lemon, iron orange, vermilion. But there's no dive swiping, gnat catching tonight. Some songbird sense the slack season upon us. Stillness readies the river, trees glimmer, and we lean uneasily into the quiet. 3 warblers balance on one blackberry cane. Not ordinary warblers, yellow-breasted chats gone silent in the breeze. There's no yellow chip, no whistle, caw, nor rattle, just 3 imperceptible heartbeats screaming through silver thorns and bramble. Is there night not unlike our country? Somewhere a raptor hovers, drags her talons over Arab neighborhoods while we lie awake. In my wife's eyes, a blue flame flickers. World news, a helicopter turns, delivering or receiving the dead. We hardly notice. Midnight passing over as we tilt and spin on the dreadful wing of a hawk who says she loves us. Crows on our tail, relentless. I think I hear one say, "Come home." And that's a love poem. It's a love poem for the people who serve our country. And it's a love poem that's dedicated to the wives and the husbands who are waiting for their spouses to return. Sunshine. Daddy? I like it when the sun interrupts us. Oh yes, yes. Like when it burns through fog, splashing leaves, and touches the side of your face, warm as your mother's kiss. No, Dad. Just the sun, all by itself. No kiss, no flame, no leaves. Just the sun's sudden rays pouring down right here, right now, on you and me. Okay. 2 more. When you bring my meds, I am strung out at the end of Ward 3, in the midst of a dream flying over Havens Elementary. I am no longer old. My bones so light the sun lifts me from the balcony of my decrepit body and releases me into the atmosphere of your white frock. And I am grateful, for I have died 5 times already since my wife's elongated stop, her slow surrender to Alzheimer's, and my daughter's inevitable leaving when they shed my name like snakes shed skin in early morning sun. For men who take one look at me and see only an old man, no inheritance, no plan, only the slow drip, drip, drip to keep him company, the piped in oxygen, cigarette grip on the channel changer. This day is a gift, really. When you come, the round gears of the sun and trees outmuscle the blinds and release me. The sky and swifts make love again, and my disease subsides, docile as a sweet little lapdog. I am so lucky to have you here with me, holding my hand as if it were a living thing, saying nothing and everything I ever needed. Your eyes guiding me safely over the tarmac of what my healers call my advanced dementia. Okay, poetry is really, it's a subversive act because we're going against who, we're going into the minds of other people. We're carrying voices that are not heard otherwise. The speaking truth to power thing is overused, but it's hopefully speaking the truth to someone who needs to hear it. But in the process of all this, being a poet or a writer, it takes time away from other pursuits, and it takes time away from your family, your children. It's in some ways it's an act of infidelity. I mean, if you have a guilty conscience like Jews like myself, you feel guilty about taking so much time on this stuff, and it's. But I don't think I could be a loving father and a devoted husband and a productive member of society if I didn't do this. So that's my excuse. And this is my last poem, final poem, Infidelity. For a long time, I lingered behind a two-way mirror looking in. Leaves fell all around me. The room, backlit by a fire, was well appointed. My inner self seemed satisfied with the upholstery. I had a family, and they appeared to love me. 2 daughters tugged their mother's Angora sweater, which felt like summer, though it was winter, and the firelight shined on their faces, and they appeared as angels. Somehow, I was a good father. Some instinct made my circuitry work. how lucky was I? The halo of their admiration my wife polished daily during my inexplicable absence. I camped there for what seemed like years, at the verge of the wood on the outskirts of my life, unable to ward off the weather. I could no longer stand my outside self watching my inside self looking out or in. Then the snow parted, and she called my name. And when she called me in from the woodpile, she was lovely, and we were young again, and it was spring. So I guess I'm available to take questions. Is that how it works?
Yeah.
Or, yes, sir.
What is a prompt question?
Oh, a prompt question is just a question that a writer will pose to him or herself, or an instructor will say, here's a question that should help you get started in writing something. So a question, think about, well, this isn't really a question, it's just a statement, I guess. But, think about a keepsake, an object from long ago that's important to you, and begin describing it or writing about it or whatever emotions or meanings come out of it. Start writing. It's a free writing exercise. Tom?
What's your writing practice? When do you write?
Catch as catch can. My day job, I'm writing, I'm doing technical writing. I'm writing zoning ordinances, and it's the opposite side of the brain. So if something occurs to me and I'm in the car, I'll remember it. And if I'm, I don't really have a practice. I just do the best that I can. Yeah. Thanks. Yes.
I don't really have a question. I just wanted to thank you. I had a wonderful delivery.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for being here. Are there any other questions or comments or anything? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Stay warm.